Thanks a lot, Colin. Glad to be here. Glad everybody is so intrigued with hummingbirds that they signed up for this program today. I find it a fascinating bird group. It's actually the second largest family of birds in the world. I think there's about 360 species in this family. The largest family is the tyrant flycatchers, and we do have some representatives of those in our area as well. That's about 425 species in that family. But the hummingbirds are by far way more interesting. The only problem for me is that, I love hummingbirds and I'll travel anywhere to see them. And I have to do that because
why do they go away?
We only have one species here. And it sounds like we need to mute more people. So some of the things that I want to cover today, we're going to cover classification, world distribution, ranges and migration for hummingbirds, their size, diet, bird-plant relationships, feeding strategies, courtship, nesting, torpidity, and mortality. And when I first put this program together, I've been doing this talk for quite a few years now. And many years ago, when I put it together the first time, I came across this little children's book. And in it, I found on the first page, it said that hummingbirds are the only birds that can fly backwards. They can fly straight up and down and sideways too. And he can even fly when he is upside down, and he can perhaps, strangest of all, fly without going anywhere. It's like a little tiny helicopter. And hummingbirds are the smallest birds in the world. There are many kinds, and they are all beautiful. They are like little jewels with wings. Though they are tiny, they are very brave, and all of that is very true. So I'm going to try and fill in some of the gaps in there for you so you have the complete story. So we've admired hummingbirds and had an appreciation for hummingbirds for hundreds of thousands of years. And basically, there's some representations here that show how various cultures have integrated hummingbirds into their lives. You can see this is a archaeological find. This is a stone carving, and it's actually a representation of a hummingbird. Anyone who's been lucky enough to make it down to Peru and see the Nazca line drawings out in the desert, if you're flying overhead, you can see this image of a hummingbird out in the desert. And this is actually a very huge image. Mind-boggling that they could even create something like that. This image here is actually much closer to home. This is found in New Mexico, and this type of artwork is called petroglyphs, and that's where they actually carve a little bit into the stone, and they get down through the patina that's on the stone, and they find a paler surface underneath, and that's what gives you the image. And I was intrigued by this image, and I wanted to include it in my program. And I was in New Mexico about 3-4 years ago, and while we were there, just outside of Albuquerque is the Petroglyph National Monument. So we went and visited that, and I actually found this exact petroglyph. So this is now my photograph as opposed to swiping something off of the internet. So it was nice to make that connection and be able to actually see this for myself. Some of the other things down here, this is some fine pottery, and you can see there's a representation of hummingbirds in here. This is an Inuit drumhead, and you can see hummingbirds there. And then usually when I do this talk in person, I tell everybody in the audience to look to their left. I'm still searching for this person with this hummingbird tattoo on their shoulder. So obviously we can't do that today. But it's quite apparent that we hold hummingbirds in high regard, and you can tell just by some of the names that these birds receive. And here's just a smattering of some pictures that I've taken and friends of mine have taken on various trips to South and Central America. And you can see that there's a lot of diversity in what these hummingbirds look like. We're used to just seeing that ruby-throated, but there's a lot of diversity besides that. And you can tell by the names that we hold them in high regard, because there are many different sapphires and emeralds and wood stars and hill stars and sunbeams and sun angels, comets, jewel fronts. So all of these, are dazzling names, and many different gemstones are represented there. So obviously, we think of these birds in high regard, and they do attract a lot of attention just because they are, so glittery. And I'll get into how that occurs in just a little bit. So just to give you some perspective on hummingbirds and how they fit into the birding world, they're actually very closely related to a group of birds called swifts. And swifts are found worldwide. We only have one representation here in North America, and it's called the chimney swift. And then in Europe, there's another one called the common swift. And you get into other continents, and there's many, many different swifts to choose from. But hummingbirds and swifts are very, very closely related. They have some characteristics that they share. They have very small feet that are incapable of, providing any support for them. So they actually never walk. They only fly from place to place, and then they can use them to grip and hold on to their perch. But beyond that, those feet are useless to them. They both have more or less of a fixed wing, and so it's a very, very stiff wing beat. And in the case of the hummingbirds, the reason that they can hover and fly backwards and fly upside down is that they actually not only propel themselves on the downbeat, but their wings actually pivot, and they can actually get lift, from their upbeat as well. So it's very interesting that they can do that. So about 57 million years ago, swifts and hummingbirds were actually in the same family. And then it was about 17 million years ago, or 40 million years ago, there was another split that took place, and that was to separate typical hummingbirds, which are ruby-throated hummingbird would be in that group. And they split away from a group called the hermits. And they're quite different looking hummingbirds. Their coloration patterns are quite different. Many of them have these very unique looking curved bills, and they are the ones that probably have some of the most significant relationships with plants. And we'll talk a little bit about that. So we only find hummingbirds today in the Western Hemisphere. So that's North America and South America. And we do not find them anywhere else in the world. But ironically, the oldest known fossil of a hummingbird comes from Europe. It was actually found in Germany, and it represented a species that was it was determined that it was 34 to 30 million years old when it was discovered. So at one point in time, and certainly the continents have been shifting. So I suppose if we played that game and tried to figure out where the continents were at that time, we'd see that, it's more likely that hummingbirds could have been on other continents besides North and South America. But that's the only place you're going to find them now. And because of that, many of the international trips that I take, in particular, if I'm searching for hummingbirds, I'm spending a lot of time in Central and in South America. I've been down there 25 times now. And so here's a world view of where the hummingbirds are. And of course, we're right about here. But the universe, the central point for the universe of hummingbirds exists in Ecuador. And that's where the equator is passing through this way. And then you have the spine of the Andes coming down through South America like this. And so at that juncture right there, that's where we find Ecuador. And in that small country, which is about the size of Colorado, if you can kind of envision how large Colorado is, there are 163 species of hummingbirds found in a place the size of Colorado, which is amazing when you think about the fact that the whole eastern half of the United States and up into Canada here has only one species. And so that's a tremendously large area compared to Ecuador. But we're getting away from that axis point here. So as you move further and further away from there, going either north or going south, for example, if you look at the neighboring countries of Colombia and Peru, you'll see that already the numbers are dropping off. And these are two countries that are 5 times the size of Ecuador. Well, by the time you get all the way down here to the southern tip of South America, down into Tierra del Fuego, whether you're in Chile or if you're in Argentina, you're only going to find one species of hummingbird down there. And likewise, if you go as far north as you can, traditionally, there's only been one species of hummingbird up here, and that's the rufous hummingbird. Since I put this program together, there's now a second species that periodically shows up there, and it's called the Anna's hummingbird. So we might have to change my graphics. And while I'm doing that, I'll probably spell Colombia properly next time. So at any rate, you can see that as you go further and further away from that high point there, the numbers are dropping off significantly. In all of the United States, we only have 16 species, and then some of those make it as far up as Canada. It's the same, it's a subset of the ones that are here in the United States. And we only have to go across the Mexican border to see that, the number jumps significantly. Then we're up to about 50 species there. So there are some lookalikes. Quite often I'll get a question from somebody. They want to know what hummingbird they're seeing in their backyard, and there's this tiny hummingbird. It's the smallest one they've ever seen, and quite often that ends up being a moth. And there's a couple of species of moths that we have that are sometimes mistaken for hummingbirds. One would be a sphinx moth, which is this one here. And they have that same kind of, the wings are just, beating so quickly that, they become a blur. And so it looks like it's a hummingbird. And then when they're actually feeding on the nectar, they do have their little proboscis and tongue sticking out. And so it does look like, the bill of a bird, I suppose. And this one here is actually called hummingbird moth. So, of course, when it was named, people recognized the fact that it could be mistaken for a hummingbird. If we go to other continents, if we're in, let's say, Australia, or if you're in Africa, Southeast Asia, you're going to run into these birds. They're sunbirds, and they have a lot of characteristics that look similar to hummingbirds, and you might think that you're seeing a hummingbird. There is all that iridescence and a lot of bright colors going on in many cases, and they sometimes have these ornate-looking bills. But these birds, even though they're drinking nectar just like hummingbirds are, you can see that they always have to perch on something in order to feed. They do not have the capability to hover at all. So in some of my recent trips, I guess they're not that recent anymore. We've been sitting on our hands for a couple of years, haven't been able to travel. But my last trips down into Colombia and into Ecuador, here's a few representations. And I just want to give you a feel for what the diversity of this bird family looks like. It is very, very diverse. So we think of hummingbirds as having long bills, yet there are these thorn bills that have these little tiny bills. In fact, the shortest bill on a thornbill that I'm aware of is about 1/4 of an inch long. So it's a very, very small bill. If you compare that to something here like these, most of our star frontlets have these really long straight bills like that. Train bearers are famous for the fact that they really do have these very, very long tails. And they're also a short-billed hummingbird. And then sparkling violet ear is a very common species up in the Andes, and we run into it quite frequently. Here's a few more examples. Crowned wood nymph. This is something I think I photographed in Colombia. And, just very, very bright colors, a lot of iridescence going on. Here's a mango, black-throated mango, white-necked Jacobin, and wire-crested thorntail. So again, just to give you a little bit of a feel for the diversity that's out there. On one of my last trips to Ecuador, this was in 2018. I was actually there twice in 2018. I was searching for a long time to get this hummingbird. It's called the olive-spotted hummingbird. This is my photograph here. Obviously, the bird was at distance. And this is what it would look like if you're looking through a pair of high-powered binoculars, or if you're much closer. And it's not a stunning bird, but it was my 200th hummingbird. So it was a very significant one for me. And what's unique about this hummingbird is it's a specialist down in the Amazon that is found residing only on islands that exist within some of the large rivers. Even though the same kind of habitat, at least in appearance, when we look at it, it looks like, they should be able to find homes along the sides of the river as well, but they stick to those river islands. And so that's what you have to do in order to get them. You have to go out and visit some of these little islands and bushwhack your way through the islands because there aren't any trails out there. And eventually you'll find one of these guys. So I wanted to give you a taste of what I see when I'm out in my travels. Quite often we do visit hummingbird feeding stations. This one was in Colombia, and it was on the outskirts of Bogota. And it's just pretty amazing. Obviously the image is too small, so you can't really make out specific species in this video. But I do have one coming up where we'll actually be able to identify some of these guys. So, pretty amazing to have that in your backyard, right? This is another place that I like to go. I've been here a couple of times. This is in Ecuador now, and we're on the east slope of the Andes at about 4,500 feet. And I like this particular video because it gives you an opportunity to actually hear some of the vocalizations of the hummingbirds. Hopefully that's coming through to your computers as well. You can tell they're not real songsters. This one here is called a brown violet ear. The little guy that was here just a minute ago, that was a female wire-crested thorntail. This is a golden-tailed sapphire here. This is going to be a key player to my next story, this one and this one as well. I'll just let you watch this for a minute or two. It's a female sapphire tail there. That's the male. So the predominant species that were visiting this feeding station were the brown violet ears. You can see there's quite a few of those. And one of the reasons I want you to watch this video is you can see just how aggressive these birds can get. And just by looking at that feeder, you can see it's, the main reservoir is empty already. And what was happening is that there were quite a few feeders set up, but they were all running out of sugar water. And the people who worked at the lodge were one by one, they were taking these feeders down to clean them and then refill them. And so what that led to was quite an amazing situation that I experienced. We just had a many spotted hummingbird there for a second. That's the female golden-tailed sapphire again. That's the many spotted right there. You'll see some other little interesting guys come in just a minute here. This is a female booted racketail, made a brief appearance before I moved the camera. This is a rufous vented white tip, this one up here. That was actually a hummingbird I had never seen before I shot this video. So even though I've been to Ecuador for 10 visits, I still end up seeing hummingbirds that I've never seen before. Back down to this feeder, there's that female booted racketail again, and the male should be coming in just a second here. There he is, that's the male. That one's right in the center there. So you get the general idea, there's lots and lots of hummingbirds, right? And I've been to some feeding stations that are even more amazing than that. But it leads up to a little story. So here's where all of that was being filmed. It was, you see this main post here, and off of that there was a whole rack of hummingbird feeders. And you can see this gentleman here, it's raining out, and he's taking all the feeders down as they're emptied out, and he's busily cleaning them, and then he's going to refill them. Well, hummingbirds are very territorial. You can see how aggressive they were acting, and they're very curious. They're always looking for their next meal, because you can always think of hummingbirds as being just a couple hours away from total starvation, because they have that really high metabolism. So they're always looking for new opportunities. While we were watching those feeders, a couple of our friends were actually staying in the lodge while it was raining. Well, they came out just to see what we were up to, and one of them brought along this book. And I noticed that the hummingbirds were immediately attracted to this red binding. So I asked if I could borrow it, and I set it on my lap, and within a minute I had brown violet ears landing on my knee. So then I got the idea that if I would hold the book in my hand and actually put my fingers out as little perches, you can look on my left hand over here, and though it's kind of hidden because of the color of this railing here, but there's a brown violet ear sitting on my finger, and he's now looking down into this little dark area between my fingers and the book, thinking that it's a port like on a hummingbird feeder, and he was actually poking his head down in there trying to find where all the sugar water was. Of course, there wasn't any there. So here's a still shot of the golden-tailed sapphire. We saw that several times in the video, and then here's a still shot of the brown violet ear. Well, while I was sitting there and birds were being attracted to this book, I had a golden-tailed sapphire hovering right next to my face, right on the side of my face, and I could actually feel his wing beats touching my cheek. The next thing I felt was his bill went into my ear, and with one little quick shot of his tongue, he probed into my ear, decided he didn't like earwax, and he left. And then within a minute, all of a sudden I had a brown violet ear in my face and did the exact same thing to my nose. So I've been going down there, as I said, for 20 some years, made 25 trips down into these regions. I've never ever experienced anything like this, but it was just totally amazing, totally bizarre. And I believe it all has to do with the fact that these birds were, they were under duress because of the fact that their feeding stations had been shut down. They also are going to be feeding on natural foods as well. They don't rely all that much on the feeders, but they were probably impeded in that regard because of the rain that was coming down. It was a fairly heavy rain. So they were anxious to find some kind of food source, and they were checking me out to see if I was it. So 2 years later, I was back at the same lodge, and this time I came well equipped. I found a little jar that I could paint the rim, the same color as our hummingbird feeders. And then I put a little line on there to then designate how much water I needed to add to 3 packets of sugar. So I put my 3 little packets in there, and I filled up the rest of the jar up to that water line and stirred it all up, and I marched out to where the feeders were. And here's the reaction from the hummingbirds. These are fawn-breasted brilliants. You can tell just by the way they're leaning away from their perch that they don't want to have anything to do with me. So what was magical about that time in 2015 versus this trip in 2018 is beyond me. But certainly they didn't want to have anything to do with me. So let's talk a little more about distribution of hummingbirds. I briefly touched on the fact that the ruby-throated hummingbird, covers the eastern half of North America, and that's a very large range. But the hummingbird, the largest range of all, would be this one here. It's the long-billed starthroat. And even though it's distributed across a huge area, it includes southern Mexico, all of Central America, and South America, as far south as southern Brazil. So it has a very extensive range. But it took me a very, very long time to find this bird because in nowhere in its range is it considered common. The distribution of this bird is very, very sparse. And so it took a lot of searching to find this one. But that's a huge, huge range for one species of hummingbird. Some of these other ones, their ranges are no more than a couple valleys in the mountains, very, very small ranges. So here, closer to home in North America, we have 16 species of hummingbirds that can be expected, and 8 of those are regular breeders, and those would include ruby-throated, the one that we have. And then we have black-chin, costas, annas, broad-tailed, calliope, rufus, and allens. And there are another 5 that migrate just north out of Mexico, and they do sometimes breed in our country. And so that would be broad-billed, buff-bellied, blue-throated riveles, and Lucifer's hummingbird. And then there are 3 more that are just really irregular, and sometimes they just come over the Mexican border as post-breeding migrants, and they're just kind of wandering around a bit. And those would include violet-crowned, barreline, and white-eared. So there are also fairly rarely occurring surprises that show up here in North America. We have had things like green violet ear and green-breasted mango show up here in Illinois. So a lot of strange things can happen. But here's our hummingbird. This is the ruby-throated hummingbird. And again, you can see what the range looks like for the species. It does cover all of the eastern half of the United States. And you can see it does kind of go across the plains area of Canada as well. And in migration, they're going to travel down here into Mexico, and they do make it down all the way to Panama. And that's as far south as I've ever seen a ruby-throated hummingbird. I did see them in Panama, but I've never seen them anywhere in South America. So they have a couple different routes that they utilize in order to make it down here to their wintering grounds. Some of them will stay on the land, and they do go around the Gulf. Some will actually fly across the Gulf, coming off of the most southerly tips here and then hitting the Yucatan. And some are doing some island hopping in order to get down here. And some will actually stay in the southernmost part of Florida as well. So not all of them are actually leaving the continent. This is a representation of what the male looks like. Here's another representation here. You can see it does have that ruby throat that it's named for. This is a immature male, and the reason I know that is you can see these little fine spots starting to appear in the throat. Those are actually these ruby red feathers starting to come in. A completely clean throat like we see on this individual here, that would be the female. So often people say that they have different hummingbirds showing up at their feeders, but basically we're seeing the ruby-throated hummingbird in 3 different plumages. Here's broad-billed hummingbird. I'm going to run through these pretty quickly. Just keep an eye on the range maps here, just so you can get a feel for how much they enter into the United States or North America. What's unique about this one in particular, though, I will pause for just a minute. We had one of these show up in southern Chicago this spring, and many people went to see that. I didn't have the time to go chase into Chicago to see this bird, but certainly a lot of my friends did, and I received many photographs of this bird. It's really a cool bird to see way up here, and this is its normal range right down here. And it's all the way up here in Chicago. So some strange things do occur. This is buff-bellied. You can see that it's more or less coastal. It does spend time in the winter in the Yucatan, but otherwise it's up in here. Blue-throated hummingbird, which has now been changed to blue-throated mountain gem. Very large hummingbird. Again, keep an eye on those range maps. Here's magnificent hummingbird. Lucifer's hummingbird. and black-chinned hummingbird. So this is another one that has an extensive range. This is actually the counterpart in the west, counterpart to the ruby-throated. Here's Anna's, and as you can see, when these range maps were created, they weren't making it into Alaska, but they are now actually having some records of these birds breeding all the way up here in Alaska. Here's Costa's. Again, most of them are, most of these hummingbirds are ending up down in the southwest, so not very close to us. Calliope. Here's broad-tailed hummingbird. If you're in the Rocky Mountains, you quite often run into this one, and it does look a lot like our ruby-throated hummingbird. It's just lacking some facial features. Our ruby-throated has a little black area that runs below the eye here, which would be one of the key characteristics that I would look for in trying to separate it. Here is Rufous hummingbird, and this is a species that you can see what their normal range looks like. Normally, this is the one that makes it all the way up into Alaska to breed quite regularly. And this is its breeding range here. This is all a migration path, and this is where they winter traditionally. But what's been happening is some of these birds, for whatever reason, are starting to migrate down to the southeastern part of the United States. And so we're getting them in Florida, we're getting them in Georgia and Alabama, South Carolina, Louisiana. All these southern states right in the corner here are starting to have rufous hummingbirds showing up as a wintering species. And some of these birds are actually surviving, and they're making the migration back north. And so now that gene, whatever it is that's causing them to go off kilter and end up here, that's being passed along. So the number of rufous hummingbirds starting to show up in this area is actually increasing. And in order to do that, it's not a straight line when they make that migration. They're actually kind of swinging through like this. So this is a species that now shows up on very rare occasion in Illinois. And I just saw my first one on December 1st of this last year. It showed up in Lisle, Illinois. And I went there a few days later and was able to see a female rufous hummingbird. In the dead of winter, it was December. The people that were hosting this bird were nice enough to actually take their feeder in every night and keep it inside so it wouldn't freeze. And then they put it out before it was light. And that bird stuck around for about 2 weeks before it moved on. And we were fairly confident that it didn't just die there. It did actually move on. The morning that before it left, it was feeding very, very vigorously, making many trips to the feeder, and then all of a sudden just disappeared. So it must have been, recharging all of its fuel as much as possible and then moved on. So here's a close lookalike to that rufous hummingbird. This is Allen's, and again, it's a western species, southwestern. Now here are some of the vagrants that just barely come up, and on very rare occasions, we might get them breeding in North America. So that would be the white-eared and the barrel-line and violet-crowned. So we kind of zipped through that, but we have a lot to cover, so I kind of just wanted to make sure you at least got a feel for just where all of our hummingbirds are. So here's a map that shows the progress of hummingbird migration for the ruby-throated hummingbird. This particular image was captured in 2010. So if you went to this website down here, I don't know if you can read that, but if you go there, you can actually get a more current map that would reflect probably last year's data. So people basically are watching their feeders all across the country. And so when they first see a ruby-throated hummingbird at their feeder, then they enter their data and say that, they had that as a arrival date. So in 2010, our arrival dates here in the Chicago area were like the 4th of April. And generally, that's about when hummingbirds show up here. They're not coming up here, and we're not finding them in large numbers at that point in time, but usually it's about the first week in April. And I didn't see my first one until probably the second week of April this year, but I was hearing reports of them around. So you can actually track the progress of these birds as they move northward. And interestingly enough, there's another species that's migrating at the same time. It's called the yellow-bellied sapsucker. And the way that yellow-bellied sapsuckers make a living is that they actually drill sap wells in trees. So even in migration, they'll drill these sap wells, and that's where they're going to get that's their food source. That's where they're going to get their energy. Well, think about the first week of April and just how many flowers are blooming at that time. There's not a lot going on. So our hummingbirds are utilizing those same sap wells that the sapsuckers are drilling. And in addition to that, they're finding some other sources. They will eat insects, and they'll also, if they find a wound in a tree or something, they can get at sap that way. But they're their migration is actually correlated with the sapsuckers, and those male ruby-throated hummingbirds, which are leading the hummingbird migration, they probably do not extend their advance much beyond the advance of the yellow-bellied sapsucker. So they're actually closely related. Here's a map, a similar map that shows the migration patterns for that rufous hummingbird. And you can see, you've got all these dots that are representing, where this bird should be, but you see all these wintering records showing up in all these different states down here. And what I find totally amazing is that some of these May records are actually showing up here now in Maine. So not only are these birds making this crazy migration and coming across to here, we're now finding that instead of heading back to their traditional breeding grounds, some birds are showing up here in Maine in May. So what I consider this, the significance of that is that I think it's just a matter of time before we end up having breeding rufous hummingbirds here in, some that survive and successfully breed in Maine. And then that's only going to begin to expand. And before you know it, we're going to probably have a large population of rufous hummingbirds breeding here on the eastern half of the United States. That's probably not going to happen in our lifetime, but it's something that's, it looks like it's trending in that direction. So I think that's fascinating. Just to give you an idea of just how widespread hummingbirds are and how many changes are taking place. Alabama now has 12 different species represented. They have shown up either as vagrants or showing up more regularly, like that rufous hummingbird. Louisiana has 12, South Carolina has 7, Florida has 10, Mississippi has 9, Georgia 9, North Carolina 11. And here's some of the species that are showing up in those various states. So again, you're getting some weird things like green violet ear, which should be somewhere down in Mexico or further south, green-breasted mango, which is generally Central America and further south, and Bahama woodstar. Well, obviously that's coming from the Bahamas. So, there's a lot of strange things that are happening. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the characteristics of hummingbirds. One of the things is that we want to consider is the size of hummingbirds. And here's for a benchmark, here's our ruby-throated hummingbird. That's about 3.5 inches long and 0.13 of an ounce. So it's a very, very small bird. In fact, if you look at your pinky and go from the tip of the finger down to the second joint, go down 2 joints, and that's about the size of the body of a ruby-throated hummingbird. Now look at the bee hummingbird. This is only found in Cuba, and now we're talking about something that's only 2.25 inches long and 0.07 of an ounce. So that's, half the weight, and that's just such a tiny. That's actually the smallest bird in the world, that bee hummingbird. Haven't seen that one yet. The giant hummingbird on the other end of the spectrum is 8.5 inches long and 0.7 of an ounce. And so if you've been out or looking out your window and you see the black birds that are kind of wandering through your lawn, the ones that have the yellow beak and they're probing for grubs in the summertime, those are called European starlings. This hummingbird is the size of one of those starlings. So that's a very, very large hummingbird. And then as far as their wing beats, ruby-throated hummingbird, it's beating its wings 70 times per second in flight. Bee hummingbird is about 80 beats per second, and the giant hummingbird is 10 beats per second. So the larger they get, obviously, the wing beats are slowing down. In fact, when you're watching a giant hummingbird in flight, you can actually see and more or less count the wing beats as they're going. They're very noticeable, whereas when you're looking at a ruby-throated hummingbird, it's just a blur. It almost looks like there are no wings. We're going to talk a little bit about the senses that hummingbirds have and vision. They have large eyes, and they're fixed in their socket, so they don't move. Their eyes do not move around like our eyes do. But eyesight is very critical to their finding food, and they see color very, very well. Smell, most birds have a very small olfactory gland, or lobe, so they believe that they have very, very poor sense of smell. But I have a couple of examples that I've encountered that I believe show that hummingbirds do, in fact, smell, and they do locate things by smell. One time we were hiking out in the Rockies. We were in Glacier National Park, and my wife had just applied some cherry Blistex, and instantly she had a hummingbird come up, and it was just right in her face. So I believe that that bird probably wouldn't have visited without that happening. Another time I was camping with a friend of mine. We were again in the Rockies. We were in Colorado. And at this point, it was actually nighttime already. And we would expect that, hummingbirds would all be, fast asleep. We had some lanterns on, so there was some light available there. But my friend was just starting to brush his teeth. And next thing you knew, he had a hummingbird right in his face. So it obviously came out of, wherever it was sleeping. It came out, to investigate that food source, what it perceived as a food source. Taste. Birds have very, very few taste buds, 40 to 60 taste buds, whereas humans have 10,000. So taste is not important to them at all. Hearing. They respond very well to their own voices as far as, hearing other hummingbirds. And so, hearing is significant in that regard as far as for territorial disputes and for courtship, but otherwise, hearing, I don't believe, is a very critical thing for them. Touch is not well developed for most bird species, and that would be true also for hummingbirds. And navigation is where they really stand out, because these birds, once they figure out where a food source is, they never forget that, whether it's locally and during the particular season that they're visiting in, or whether it's on a return trip. If you have hummingbirds that find a feeder in your yard, you can almost be guaranteed that the next spring or fall, whenever they're migrating, they'll be back in your yard looking for that same feeder that you had out the year before. And obviously, except for those guys that are showing up in Florida for some strange reason, they do have great navigational abilities, and they do make it to their destinations quite easily. So I wanted to talk a little bit about color. I mentioned that earlier. And there's kind of a unique thing going on with hummingbirds. If we look at these two images down here, these are both ruby-throated hummingbirds. And you can see in this image, the throat looks all just black. And in this image, you can see it looks very shiny ruby red. And so what's going on here, it's a very interesting thing. There's actually not a lot of pigment being created for the feathers in hummingbirds. They only have three basic colors that they create. You'll see white, which is truly white. You'll see black, which is truly black. And you'll see rufous, at least that's a term that birders use for a rusty color. And those are really the only colors that are generated with pigment. All the other colors that you see on a hummingbird are created by very fine, minute air pockets that are part of the structure of the little bits that make up the feather. And so depending on the structure of those air pockets and how the light passes through them, that's what creates the color. So basically, color on hummingbirds, for the most part, is created through smoke and mirrors, you might say. So here's kind of a schematic that shows you. So if I take this feather and I pull out just one barb, this is the barb here, and then there are barbules on that. Each feather has, all these little barbules. And so it gets even further down like this. And once you get down into a microscopic level, you see all these little tiny air pockets. And that's what that's what we're trying to represent here. So it's all how the light is going through there. So that's why when we look back at this image, depending on how the hummingbird is facing you, and maybe you've actually noticed this in your own backyards, at 1 minute, the hummingbird's throat looks all black, and the next minute it looks red. And they can actually control how they flash that light or utilize the existing light to flash color. So if they want to be inconspicuous, they don't allow that red to be blasted around. But when they do want to impress a female, or if they want to threaten another male, they'll make sure that they utilize the lighting to accent the colors that are coming out of their feathers. But again, there is no pigment there. It's actually all done through smoke and mirrors. Here's some close-ups of some of our feathers, so you can kind of get a feel for what those look like. So I want to talk briefly about plant-bird relationships. And so these species have evolved over many, many hundreds of thousands of years. And some of our plants create more nectar than others. And so, birds or hummingbirds have managed to figure that out. Obviously, insects are also pollinators, and insects have been around a lot longer than hummingbirds have been in the evolutionary time. But for some reason, hummingbirds turned out to be better pollinators than insects, and so some of the plants actually evolved to cater more to hummingbirds than they do to insects. And the reason that hummingbirds are such better pollinators is because rain that would shut down, completely shut down insects won't shut down a hummingbird. It may deter them some, but it will not shut them down. They can fly much longer distances and bring that pollen and pollinate plants of the same species, much further away. So they're much greater at transporting. And they do have some specialization that they do with specific plants. So all of that ties in together to make them a better pollinator than the insects are. They do have bills created all for those different jobs. Here's the thornbill that has that 1/4 inch long bill. So you can see just how short that is on this purple-backed thornbill down here. And as a counter to that, look at the sword-billed hummingbird up here, and you can see that that bill is actually longer than the length of the body of that hummingbird. It's quite a remarkable bird to see. White-tipped sicklebill is out of that rufous hummingbird family, and you can see it has this very, very unique looking bill. And in order for this bird to get at the nectar, it has to actually go into some contorted positions for very unique flowers that are developed in such a way that they force the hummingbird to make these maneuvers in order to get down to the reward. And in so doing, the pollen is then deposited on various specific parts of the head. And then when they go and visit a like species of plant, they'll end up depositing that pollen and pollinating that plant because, again, the exact same portions of the head are being used. The green-crowned brilliance here, you can see it has a very, very heavy bill, so he's able to get into some pretty long tubular flowers with that long bill. It's certainly not anything as long as this, and it's probably utilizing insects more than maybe some of these other species. But again, you can see how they're specialists in the hermit family. These are all hermits, uniquely colored. This one is an exception, I suppose, and does have some of the iridescence going on in it. Unlike, typically hermits are going to be these kind of rufusy colored birds. You can see the flowers that they concentrate on are all quite unique looking. Some more just examples of various hummingbird species and a variety of flowers that they can pollinate. So we'll talk briefly about feeding strategies. And here we have, we don't have very many hummingbird species competing against each other, but you get into some of these other areas in the tropics, you'll have groups of hummingbirds all competing for resources. You could have up to 20 species, in one area. We just don't have that up here. So in order to just kind of split things up so that they can all survive and they all find their own little niche for feeding. So we have a variety of strategies. And so we have something called the high reward trap liners, which are going to be most of those hermits. They'll visit flowers that produce large quantities of nectar. And those plants might be scattered over a very large geographic range. So in order for the hummingbird to make it from plant to plant to plant and make it worth traveling that far to get to those specific plants, they have to have that high reward. And so that's why they're producing so much nectar. So those are high reward trap liners. So these are birds that are going to actually run a route like a trap bird looking for furs. He has his trap line set up. Well, hummingbirds are doing the same thing. They're just going to run that route, and it could extend linearly for a mile or more. So they're traveling great distances. Then you have low reward trap liners, which are using that same strategy, but they're maybe not looking at specific flowers to get their nectar, and their stops along the way are probably closer together. So they're running a trap line strategy, but they're not necessarily specialized for specific plants. Then we have generalists, which would probably be where our ruby-throated hummingbird fits in. And they can take a variety of feeding situations. Larger sources of wildflowers is what they're looking for. And they're usually medium or small in size and non-specific builds. We have territorial holders, and those are going to stake out a concentration of flowers in a small enough geographic area that will allow them to watch over and defend their food source. And these birds are going to be medium to larger in size with non-specific builds. Territory parasites are going to be these birds that are just really small hummingbirds. They're too small to defend a territory on their own, so they're opportunists. They're going to look for an opportunity to sneak in to another hummingbird's territory and grab food whenever they can. And then we have some birds that play dirty, the nectar thieves. I'll show you some examples of that. But these are hummingbirds that actually avoid pollinating the plant itself, and they take a shortcut in through the side of the flower, and they get at the nectar that way. So there's actually some birds down in South America that are called flower piercers. And here's some examples. We have slaty flower piercer and rusty flower piercer, black flower piercer. And they'll actually drill a hole in the side of the flower. You can see that happening here with this rusty flower piercer. There'll be hummingbirds that will follow behind them, and they'll actually utilize that same entry point that the flower piercers have created. In this example, we have a violet-tailed sylph that's using the same hole that was just created by a flower piercer. So there's more to a hummingbird's diet than just nectar. We all know that they're going to go after the nectar and flowers, but they do other things as well, and they'll go after insects. And I've actually seen hummingbirds fly catching, and they're actually catching the insects in midair. I've also seen them go to spider webs, and they'll steal the insects right out of the spider web, which is tricky business for a hummingbird, because if they get hung up in that webbing, they can be goners as well. Once they're trapped in there, they have no way to push off, and they'll actually get stuck. I mean, they're so light, they have no way to get out. And here's an example of a hummingbird coming to a sap well. So if you look out in your yard and you see a row of holes running around the side of your trunk on your tree, and if you look in there, they're kind of rectangular in shape. Those are most likely going to be sapsucker wells, and so that's what's in this image here. These are sapsucker wells, and you can see the hummingbirds coming there actually to get some of the sap. And if there were any insects that were also attracted to the sap and they're trapped in there, the hummingbird would eat those as well. So they have a variety of sources, and depending on where they are in the breeding cycle at various stages, they're going to need more protein in their diet. So they're actually going to switch away from concentrating on nectar, and they're going to look more for insects than that nectar. So courtship, we'll talk specifically about the ruby-throated hummingbird as an example. And the male is going to set up a territory, or he's going to defend a territory. So he's looking around when he comes up here in the spring. He's trying to find a place that looks like it's going to be suitable, that he'll be able to have lots of food sources. And the fact that he can control that means that he's a pretty strong and dominant male. And so that's what the female is looking for. She's looking for a male that has the ability to control a large enough territory that will support that male as well as the female. And so if she decides that he's pretty cool, then they're actually going to mate. And part of that whole process, the male can do and will do a courtship flight, which is kind of an elliptical flight pattern. And maybe some of you have seen that in the past. The female will be perched someplace, and he's just demonstrating this aerial mastery and flying in this circular pattern. As he swoops down, he just dive bombs her, shoots back up, and then dive bombs down again. It's pretty amazing to see. So if he can protect that large territory, that makes him a pretty dependable male. So that's going to be the attractant there for our female ruby-throated hummingbird. There are other approaches, and many of the hermits are famous for this. It's the lek approach, just like maybe you've heard about prairie chickens out on a lek, and they all come to the same place. All the males strut around and show their stuff. And then the females come and visit, and they pick out the coolest male, and then they go off to mate. Well, same thing in some cases with some species of hummingbirds, the same thing is happening. So there'll be these traditional leks areas in the jungle, and you'll find several males all performing, waiting for females to show up. And these leks are established and they're year after year after year. So the females know where to go to when they're searching for a male. Some of these can have as many as 100 males participating in one lek. And there's a lot of species that they actually have solitary leks. So it's established that this is the place to go find a male, but there's generally only that one male residing in that lek. And they do their performance of, shaking their wings, their tail or whatever to impress the female. And she'll pick the best male, or in the case where there's solo, she visited that lek because she probably is already interested in that male. And just to give you some more examples of hummingbirds, this is the marvelous spatula tail. Obviously, when you have these ornate feathers like this, that must come into play in courtship. And obviously that must be for bedazzling the females. Likewise, when you get into here's the long-tailed sylphs, they've got all this extra plumage here. Wire-crested thorntail has that extra crest coming up here. And coquettes, which are just amazing little hummingbirds. There's quite a few different coquettes. This one is a frilled coquette. They have very, very ornate feathering on their heads. And all of that, plumage, that extra plumage that it takes more to create, obviously is there for a reason, and it has to do with courtship. So after all the heavy lifting is done, the male has protected that territory for all of that time, and he's done all that hard work. He leaves the rest of the female. So after they've mated, the female is going to build a nest on her own, and it'll take several days to 2 weeks in order to build that nest. And when she does build that nest, she's going to be the only one feeding those young. She's going to be the only one incubating those eggs. It's all left up to her at that point. And while that's happening, the male is again still defending that territory. Some other female may come along and decide that he's really the best male around, and so he'll mate with that one as well. So he could have several females all residing in his territory that he oversees. And structurally, we can get quite a few different varieties of nests. This is a hermit. You can say red-breasted hermit, and it's using actually a palm leaf. And so the way this palm leaf curls up this way, it's actually somewhat providing some shelter from rain. This was actually a couple of photos that I shot last time I was in Ecuador, and this was actually outside of our hotel in downtown Quito. And it's kind of hard to tell, but here's the inside of the nest. I'm actually shooting down into the nest. And if you look very closely, you can see there's an egg right there, and there's an egg right there. And again, if you go back to your pinky and look at your fingernail on your pinky, that's about how big those eggs were. Very, very small. Here's the female now sitting. Here's a side view, and you can see she's sitting on that nest. So in the time it took me to go out to the Galapagos and come back, when we came back, those eggs had hatched, and she now had 2 little babies in that nest. It's kind of unique as far as nest structures. Here's some others. Again, here's one that has actually built their nest under a rooftop, basically. This is what a silk nest looks like. A very, very unique looking pattern compared to most traditional nests. You can see it gets quite crowded in these nests. So as the babies are growing, it looks like they're going to overflow that nest. But what happens is the nests that are built in a very unique way. They do use a lot of plant material in creating the nests. And then they'll take spider webbing. So they're going back to that spider web again, taking a chance and getting caught up in that spider web. They take that spider webbing and they actually wrap that around the nest. And so that secures all that plant material, but it's not stuck together. And the spider webbing has some elasticity to it. So this nest can actually expand. So as those babies grow, the size of the nest, they're actually being pushed out. And so the nest is expanding. Very fascinating. We're going to talk now about torpidity, and this is something that's happening up in the Andes. So we have hummingbirds that are actually living at between 13,000 and 15,000 feet way up in the Andes. And at that elevation, it's basically winter every single night. So these birds go into a mode of torpidity, which means that they're shutting down that metabolism. They're shutting down their heartbeat so that it's almost non-existent. And by doing so, they can actually save up to 60% of their energy that would otherwise be expended. And so that's how they get through the night, because they're not going to feed for a long period of time at night. And when they do finally come out of torpidity, then they'll begin feeding again. It takes them about an hour to revive after they've gone into this nightly slumber that is almost, you can think of it as a mini hibernation, I suppose. And obviously to save energy, the birds at this elevation, they're feeding quite differently. And so they're going to do a lot of perching as they feed, as opposed to just hovering at the eggs or at the plants. This is what the terrain looks like. It's just amazing that they can drop their body temperatures and drop their heartbeat down to points that becomes almost minimal. If they really need to, they can actually get to a point where they're saving up to 85% of their energy. So let's talk a little bit about mortality. I already mentioned that spider webs can be a big issue for hummingbirds. And you can see the result here. This one has gotten hung up in a spider web, made one too many trips and got hung up. Here's a hummingbird that's trapped. He's staring out that window. He can't find his way out of a porch or a garage. And that happens quite often. So do keep those doors closed. If you do end up getting a hummingbird trapped in one of those kind of a situations, the best thing to do is set up a feeder that they can go visit, and then you slowly move that feeder closer and closer to the exit. These birds are not the smartest things in the world, so even though it seems obvious to you that there's this opening that they should be able to easily find and get out, you may have to lead them there. But don't try to capture them. You're more likely to injure the hummingbird than to do it a favor. So try that approach of just using a feeder to lure them out. Hummingbirds can get snagged on burdock flower heads. I've seen that. I haven't seen that happen with hummingbird, but I have seen it happen with ruby-crowned kinglets and Tennessee warblers and even a bat. I found a bat one time that was dead. It was trapped on a burdock. And so these flower heads, actually, these little barbs that are coming out, there is a tiny, tiny hook on the end. And once that kind of hooks onto the feathers, there's no way that bird is going to be able to push off. Other things that might happen to hummingbirds, praying mantises will try to ambush them at feeders or at flowers. Window strikes are a huge problem, and then pesticides are a big problem. They may kill the hummingbirds directly, or they might get into the food source, and now you're eliminating that food source. All those insects are going to be gone that they need when they're looking for protein. So I did make a little trip down to Jamaica. That was one of my last hummingbird sorties before things shut down. And here's the group that I organized and brought down there. And one of the key birds I was looking for was the red-billed streamer tail. And as luck would have it, there's actually a little sanctuary outside of Montego Bay where you can go, and the proprietor has habituated hummingbirds to actually be used to humans. And so they take these little whiskey bottles that you can get on the airplane that, of course, they fill them with sugar water instead. But you put your finger out, and these hummingbirds will come and land on your finger and feed out of the little bottle. So if you can see that streamer tail, I know this is kind of a small image, but from where my cursor is there, it's going all the way down to here. So it's really a dramatically long tail. And then, of course, then it has that little short red bill that you can see there. So it was a great experience. Everybody in this picture here, took the opportunity to go ahead and feed a hummingbird that way. So it was a great experience. So some of the birds that are coming up in my future, I am going to go after that marvelous spatula tail. It's in northern Peru, and I haven't been there yet, but that's happening in 2022, COVID willing. And actually, the person that shot this picture, Jesse Fagan, is going to be my guide on that trip. And then some of the other things that are coming up in my future that I might be able to track down would be streak-throated hermit here, greenish puffleg, and green-throated mango. Those are all birds that I have a chance for in Peru or in Oaxaca, Mexico. So thanks for taking the time to attend this webinar. Hopefully I've given you some bird food for thought. And if you want to learn more about bird-related topics, I hope you'll join us looking at the DuPage Birding Club's education channel on YouTube. We actually have, because of COVID, I spent a lot of time last year making various recordings, and there's probably about 50 or 60 recordings out there for you to choose from. So you can go check those out.